Our Democrat colleagues are fond of bellowing into the TV cameras that photo ID to vote is Jim Crow. They tell us with mock earnestness. Now, I will admit, our Democrat colleagues should be experts in Jim Crow because it was Democrat politicians who passed the Jim Crow laws. It was Democrat politicians who founded the Ku Klux Klan. It was Democrat politicians for decade after decade who enforced discrimination, separate but equal, poll taxes, and a host of other laws designed to prevent African Americans from voting.
Democrats have spent months arguing that requiring a photo ID to vote is Jim Crow. Senator Ted Cruz just walked onto the Senate floor and had something to say about that. He said, and I quote, "Our Democrat colleagues should be experts in Jim Crow because it was Democrat politicians who passed the Jim Crow laws. It was Democrat politicians who founded the Ku Klux Klan. It was Democrat politicians who enforced discrimination, poll taxes, and separate but equal for decade after decade." But that was just the opening. Because then Cruz pulled out the polling numbers, and they are the last thing Democrats in Washington want the American people to see. You're about to be shocked at what he discloses.
It is shocking. It is tragic how neglected and vulnerable the protection of our elections has become. That is why I'm here today on this very floor urging the members of this body to pass the Save America Act. It says that when you register to vote in a federal election, you must provide proof that you are a citizen of the United States, and you must provide photo ID to vote. In simple terms, that's it. This is not some radical, politicized, or weaponized piece of legislation designed to restrict Americans from voting. It is a common sense measure that protects the integrity of our elections by ensuring that American citizens and only American citizens are voting in them. Legitimacy in a democracy rests on two pillars. First, the mechanical integrity of the system to produce a valid result, and second, the public's confidence in that system. If either one fails, the system falters. If both fail, the system collapses. A system that cannot be trusted is a system that cannot govern. If you look around the world, between 2/3 and 3/4 of countries require some form of identification to vote. Why? Because it safeguards the integrity of their elections and reinforces public trust in their system. So it begs the question, why hasn't the United States fully embraced this standard? Well, for the last several months, we have heard claim after claim about how this legislation would somehow inhibit people from voting, that requiring identification is discriminatory, that the American people do not support voter ID. Mr. President, our Democrat colleagues are fond of bellowing into the TV cameras that photo ID to vote is Jim Crow. They tell us with mock earnestness. Now, I will admit, our Democrat colleagues should be experts in Jim Crow because it was Democrat politicians who passed the Jim Crow laws. It was Democrat politicians who founded the Ku Klux Klan. It was Democrat politicians for decade after decade who enforced discrimination, separate but equal, poll taxes, and a host of other laws designed to prevent African Americans from voting. But do you know who has rejected their disingenuous claim that photo ID to vote is Jim Crow? The Supreme Court of the United States. Supreme Court of the United States, the state of Indiana, passed photo ID law requiring that you show a photo ID to vote, and a group of left-wing plaintiffs filed litigation challenging that. The case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. At the time, I was the Solicitor General of the state of Texas. I led a coalition of states before the Supreme Court defending photo ID to vote. And the left-wing plaintiffs made the same argument that our Democrat colleagues make today, that requiring photo ID to vote would somehow disenfranchise minorities. The Supreme Court, by a vote of 6-3, rejected their argument. The author of the majority opinion was John Paul Stevens. John Paul Stevens was one of the great liberals on the court. He was not a conservative. He was not on the right wing. He was the leading liberal for years on the U.S. Supreme Court. He rejected that claim, and he pointed out that when someone votes illegally, they are stealing the votes of legal voters. They are stealing the votes of American citizens. The Supreme Court explained that when photo ID laws have been implemented, minority participation in the election goes up, not down. And the Supreme Court explained that requiring photo ID enhances the integrity of an election and the integrity of democracy. Now, our Democrat colleagues don't want to acknowledge any of those facts. And I guess it's understandable, because the American people have heard their specious arguments and they have rejected them. Mr. President, 81% of Americans support requiring photo ID to vote. But my Democrat colleagues might say, what about African Americans? Well, about 3/4 of African Americans in the United States support requiring photo ID to vote. How about Hispanics? More than 80% of Hispanics in America support requiring photo ID to vote. How about Democrats? Here's an astonishing statistic. If you get out of elected office, if you ask a Democrat on the street, 70% of Democrats in America support requiring photo ID to vote. The one group that doesn't are elected Democrats in the United States Senate and the United States House.
Senator Ted Cruz took the Senate floor and did not hold back. He opened by calling the state of American election security shocking, tragic, neglected. And then he told the chamber exactly why he was there: to urge his colleagues to pass what he called the Save America Act. The bill is straightforward. When you register to vote in a federal election, you must provide proof of United States citizenship. And when you show up to vote, you must show a photo ID. That is it. Cruz said it was not radical, not politicized, not designed to restrict anyone from voting. It was a common-sense measure to ensure that American citizens, and only American citizens, are deciding American elections. He laid out the foundation of his arguments simply. A democracy rests on two pillars: the mechanical integrity of the system to produce a valid result, and the public's confidence in that system. If either one fails, the system falters. If both fail, the system collapses. A system that cannot be trusted is a system that cannot govern. Cruz pointed out that between 2/3 and 3/4 of countries around the world require some form of identification to vote. The reason is the same everywhere. It protects the integrity of elections and reinforces public trust. He asked the obvious question: why has the United States not fully embraced that standard? Then he turned his attention to the opposition. For months, Cruz said Democrats had claimed that requiring identification to vote would somehow inhibit people from voting, that it was discriminatory, that the American people did not support it, and their favorite line, that voter ID is Jim Crow. Cruz looked into the chamber and said that Democrats should be experts on Jim Crow, because it was Democrat politicians who wrote the Jim Crow laws. It was Democrat politicians who founded the Ku Klux Klan. It was Democrat politicians who enforced discrimination, poll taxes, separate but equal, and every other mechanism designed to keep Black Americans away from the ballot box for decade after decade. But Cruz did not stop at history. He pointed out that the Supreme Court of the United States had already settled this argument. The state of Indiana passed a photo ID voting law. A coalition of left-wing plaintiffs sued all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing it would disenfranchise minorities. Cruz said he was the Solicitor General of Texas at the time and personally led a coalition of states before the court defending the law. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in favor of photo ID, and the author of the majority opinion was not a conservative. It was Justice John Paul Stevens. for years considered the leading liberal voice on the entire court. Stevens rejected the disenfranchisement argument completely. He wrote that when someone votes illegally, they are stealing the vote of a legal citizen. And he pointed out that when photo ID laws are implemented, minority participation in elections goes up, not down. The Supreme Court ruled that photo ID enhances the integrity of elections and the integrity of democracy itself. Then Cruz pulled out the polling numbers. 81% of Americans support requiring photo ID to vote, not a slim majority. 81%. Cruz anticipated the pushback and addressed it directly. What about Black Americans? 3/4 of African Americans support photo ID to vote. What about Hispanic Americans? More than 80% of Hispanics supported. What about Democrats specifically? Here is where it gets remarkable. 70% of Democrat voters, regular Americans who identify as Democrats, support requiring photo ID to vote. 7 out of 10. The only group in the entire country that does not support it is elected Democrats in the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives. Cruz let that land. The voters support it. The Supreme Court upheld it. 2/3 of the world already does it. 3/4 of Black Americans want it. 70% of Democrat voters want it. And the only people standing in the way are the ones who were elected to represent them.